This is the place. This is where we narrowly escaped death. It was March 14th, 2011. We were riding in this car that belonged to our Libyan guide. We came under attack. He was killed. This is the case for his glasses. This is his cell phone. Abdul Latif al-Hadi was a native of Benghazi. He was our interpreter, but also a close friend.
Because we are not human. If we are human, we not choose.
Are they your glasses?
Yeah. Our team consists of me, Jürgen Todenhöfer, and Julia Leeb. She's a photographer and videographer. I'm a former member of the German Parliament and a publishing executive. I've also authored a number of books on global conflicts. For a year, we traveled through the countries swept up in the democratic fervor that became known as the Arab Spring. We documented the turbulent change in Egypt, Libya, and Syria. I predict that all Arab countries will undergo revolutionary change and someday enjoy democracy. I wanted to witness this movement firsthand. I wanted to see how people reacted and how willing they were to fight for their freedom. I've been traveling in Arab countries for 50 years. I've always wondered why the people didn't rise up against oppression, why they didn't defend themselves against dictators that received massive support from the West. We in the Western world have been conditioned to think about the Arab people as fanatics, terrorists, and unfriendly. That's partially because of George W. Bush after 9/11. But actually, the Arab people are very outgoing and friendly. The revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt are further proof of that. In mid-February 2011, we left Cairo en route to Benghazi. We encountered the first victims at a border crossing. They were guest workers, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa. When the fighting broke out, they were stranded here on the border. It took quite a bit of negotiating, but finally they let us pass, but only on foot. Benghazi. This is where the uprising began in February 2011. The rebels soon took control of the city and much of eastern Libya. The people were euphoric and determined to topple Gaddafi. They stormed this army base and seized weapons. But the rebels also made a grisly discovery: underground dungeons where dissidents were essentially buried alive. People told us that for years they heard the cries for help coming from below ground. A secret rendezvous. Our interpreter, Abdul Latif, had established connections with the rebel leader. As we waited, Latif read passages aloud from one of my books that had been published in Arabic. At this time, Mustafa Abdul al-Jalil was a wanted man, risking his life in a nascent rebellion. Until recently, he'd served as Gaddafi's justice minister. Suddenly, he was the political figurehead of the rebellion. Now he chairs Libya's National Transitional Council. The fact that the Arab world could read the words of a Western author opened many doors for us. By this time, Jalil had already expressed his fervent hope that NATO would intervene on behalf of the rebels.
Everyone should understand that the Libyan people no longer want Gaddafi as their leader, as the head of state. mainly because of the brutality he has used against his own people. And his threat, either lay down your arms or I will kill you.
By March, the rebellion had erupted into a full-blown war. Casualties rose dramatically, and civilians were increasingly caught in the crossfire. Fears escalated of an all-out bloodbath in Benghazi. A physician allows us into an operating room, begging us to show the world what's happening in Libya. 22-year-old Fatia was shot and critically wounded during an attack by Gaddafi forces. Then he tells us she died moments ago. It was a violent revolution from the very beginning, and then NATO became involved. Imagine what would have happened if NATO had not intervened to help Libyans regain their self-respect along with freedom and democracy. So it seems to me that Nicolas Sarkozy and other Western leaders should march into Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and fight for democracy there. But in those countries, we support the very leaders that suppress democracy. I always try to get as near as possible to the truth and to see both sides of the coin. And that's why we traveled to Brega. I wanted to visit the city that Gaddafi called home and see what was happening there. I was hoping to separate fact from fiction. Along the way, rebels offered us looted guns and ammunition. We declined. I tried to make it clear to them that a pen was my preferred weapon. We were fed misinformation. We had no idea that Gaddafi's forces were advancing, and essentially we drove right into the middle of the preparations for this offensive. And then we saw burned-out cars. Fires were still burning. We got out of the car to have a look around, and Abdul Latif did too. And as we were looking into one of the burned-out hulks, Latif got back into the car.
Do you think there were people inside?
And at the same time, Gaddafi's forces were taking aim. They fired surface-to-surface missiles from a distance of 4.5 kilometers, targeting our vehicle.
Where did it come from? I didn't see it.
We wanted to seek cover behind the burned-out cars, but the artillery fire began.
What can we do?
We hid behind a hillock. I realized I carried ultimate responsibility for two young people that might be killed within 15 minutes or an hour. Julia said to me, "What do you think? How much longer have we got to live?" They bombarded us for 4 hours. They wanted to make sure that there were no survivors. Abdul Latif was killed in his car. At some point, the shelling came to an end, and we wandered through the desert, lost for 6 hours. Eventually, rebel troops came to our rescue. But even the rebel stronghold, Al-Gaddafi, was unsafe. Just hours after we left, Gaddafi's forces recaptured the city. It was the longest afternoon and the longest night of my life. In February 2011, we had covered the anti-Mubarak protests in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Hosni Mubarak had ruled Egypt for 3 decades with generous Western support. I hope that all Arabs achieve democracy, but I also hope they can free themselves from our colonialism, our neo-colonialism, and our arrogance. As Henry Kissinger once said, oil is much too important a commodity to be left in the hands of the Arabs.
Us for so long time, okay? They don't give us any rights. They just control us with emergency law. Anybody, you know, I'm in this revolution for now about 14 days, something like this. Just we came out and said we are in peace. And what else? I have a shot here on my neck. I have a bump here in. Okay, it is reside right now in my neck.
I've chronicled a lot of revolutions, and I know courage alone is not enough. A group dynamic must evolve as well. A single spark ignites something larger than life. And those who felt powerless suddenly realize that they are powerful. They watch themselves on TV at night and recognize that their actions are on the verge of toppling the powerful. After that, there is no turning back. They all thanked us for coming. It was important for them that the world realized what they were doing. I was amazed that the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia were peaceful. People let themselves be shot at. They were prepared to die but not to kill. I have a lot of respect for this form of peaceful revolution. It reminds me of Gandhi or Martin Luther King, all of the great leaders who did everything in their power to achieve freedom. On February 11, 2011, Hosni Mubarak stepped down. It marked an historic day for Egypt as euphoric celebrations erupted throughout the country. I'm not doing this just for myself. My aim is to inform the German public and people around the world. We traveled to Damascus on tourist visas. The government has barred foreign journalists, and the number of vacationers has dwindled to a trickle. On the surface, it's business as usual. The Syrian people are friendly and outgoing as always. In May and June 2011, peace and quiet reigns in Damascus, despite the many internet videos purportedly showing growing unrest throughout the country. But the Western media is reporting that the military has sealed off Daraa, where the unrest began. There are reports of unspeakable brutality against the citizens of Daraa. Surprisingly, we're able to pass right through a checkpoint on the outskirts of the city. We'll attempt to see for ourselves what's happening. Julia was doing a lot of filming in Daraa, and that attracted the Secret Service. We were subjected to a long and strenuous interrogation. The Secret Service didn't believe that we were simply tourists, but somehow we managed to talk ourselves out of a tight spot. They escorted us out of the city, so we didn't get to witness much. That evening in the capital Damascus, we took a stroll on the university campus. We spoke at length with students. At the time, we had no idea that our every move was being watched. Before long, the secret police cut our conversations short. Again, we were subjected to interrogation. I always try to be as friendly as possible with the officers. I show an interest in them, try to laugh and be as happy as possible. I tell them it wouldn't be worth the effort to arrest me. I maintain a sense of humor and then talk about the Bayern Munich soccer team. Things where we have common ground. It works most of the time. June 2011, we're back in Benghazi. NATO has long since intervened, crippling Gaddafi's forces and keeping the rebel movement alive. But the dictator is still clinging to power.
wann fällt Gaddafi?
يسقط القذافي.
يسقط القذافي ربي هو يعلم يسقط.
I ask them when Gaddafi will fall.
2 days? Are you sure? Yeah. 2 days? I don't remember you.
إن شاء الله جونا أنا أنت زورونا مش تخلونا تسيبونا.
We're still troubled by the death of our friend and translator Abdul Latif. We pay a visit to his family. We wonder how his relatives will react and whether they'll blame us for his death. In hopes of providing some form of closure, we describe our last few hours with Abdul Latif.
Ich fühle mich natürlich verantwortlich für den Tod.
I take responsibility for his death. Abdul Latif was not some inexperienced youngster. He was a 55-year-old adult who volunteered to take us there. His attitude was, why not? But he did it because he wanted to help me. And then I met his mother.
My son led an honorable life. My son died honorably. God will help me through this difficult time.
She made it incredibly easy for us, taking both Julia and me into her heart. We became close friends.
Und wir sind Freunde geworden.
Cairo newspapers carry a report that the border with the Gaza Strip has been opened. Time will tell whether the Arab Spring movement will take hold among the 1.5 million Palestinians who live inside this enclave. The Islamist militant group Hamas rules the region with an iron fist. The border gates remain closed. Suddenly, a shadowy figure comes our way and offers to smuggle us in through the tunnel network. I always try to get as close as possible to the events I'm covering. I'm always going for the close-up. It's one thing to talk and moan about Gaza. Actually experiencing it is something else altogether. There's something unsettling about this.
Okay.
The first impression is one of utter ruin. The second, of friendly people. Even the feared Hamas militia allows us to come and go as we please. The people here also thirst for freedom, but there's no hint of popular dissent. The only chance Arabs have is peaceful, non-violent demonstrations. All Arabs who feel they've been mistreated should join together in a peaceful protest. That's how Gandhi did it. He simply stood up and demanded his rights. He didn't do it by dropping bombs and killing Israelis. Anyway, that's my dream, and I hope it'll come true someday. Euphoric celebrations in the Libyan capital Tripoli. It's late August and Gaddafi has been forced into hiding. Until a few months ago, he regularly welcomed VIP guests from around the world. Libya's oil wealth had always been a major drawing card. The private quarters of Gaddafi's daughter Aisha were ransacked.
But as you see, Libyan people now, they are playing in this house and they are dancing, cheering. But he cannot do anything. What you can do now, Gaddafi, what? Because you are finished and we are free now.
In the hasty retreat from Tripoli, Gaddafi left one of his most prized possessions behind. His pilots remain on duty in the aircraft, ready to take off at a moment's notice.
Salam alaikum.
It's quite luxurious, but it's also tastefully decorated. A German firm did the interior. What I found amusing was that there was a big bed in the plane's bedroom, but Gaddafi himself was afraid of flying and never took long flights. The rebel victory came at a heavy cost. The death toll was staggering, and many doctors that should have been saving lives took up arms instead.
I can show you. This, as I told you, I was one of the rebels.
You are this one?
Yeah, I'm this one. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So we were fighters and doctors at the same time.
The rebellion cost tens of thousands of lives. I oppose violent revolution. It's not worth the lives of 50,000 people just to get rid of a lunatic like Gaddafi. There are other avenues, diplomatic pressure, for instance. But no attempt was made. The leaders who authorized the airstrikes were the very same people who used to fawn over Gaddafi. Sarkozy, Berlusconi, all the rest. They made no attempt to instill democracy, to make him an offer in return for allowing democratic government. It was never tried. The West never told an Arab country to stop torturing its own citizens. By August 2011, change had come to Tripoli. The old Green Square was renamed Martyrs Square. The city celebrated the end of Ramadan without Gaddafi. His more than 40-year rule was effectively at an end. Shortly before his death, we promised our friend Abdul Latif that we'd travel to Tripoli. Now he's been named a martyr, so we posted a picture of him on the square. October 2011, we're on our way back to Syria. I was arrested at Damascus airport. Apparently the Syrian Secret Service has put me on a list of people not allowed to enter the country. They say it's because I wrote an article critical of the Syrian regime for the German newspaper Die Zeit. A Syrian-German doctor observed my arrest. He later had an audience with President Assad and told him that some people are trying to form an objective opinion of the country and that those people were arrested at the airport. This time, too, we're set free. To our surprise, we're witness to a massive demonstration. It's October 2011, and the protesters want democratic reforms under the guidance of President Assad. After 4 weeks spent in the country, our assessment is different than much of the Western press. It seems to us that most people still support Assad. To our further surprise, President Assad grants us a 2-hour interview, speaking openly about recent events and attempting to explain why he hasn't kept his promise of instituting democratic reform.
Yeah, free parties support anyone, but the problem, as I said, because you won't have long time, they won't have long time to have strong parties. That's the problem. It is going to be a problem. We cannot have solution. Yeah, everybody can run. Parties, legal, illegal, anyone. But I mean, to have free competitors now, you don't have it. So you're going to win the majority.
Yeah, but nobody hinders you to say that now.
Even the new presidential elections, everything related to the parliament. That's one. I think even in your country parliament, the most important thing for everybody cares about the parliament. But I hate when people are telling you, if I want to say something. Sorry.
You are the most important.
To lead the process. But I mean, for them, the participation cannot be through the participation.
Why? But you can say that all this process is to reach the target of a democracy in the rule of law. And at the end, yourself...
Yeah, I can say this, but this is only rhetoric. If the other solution is the time. It will take them 1 year. We cannot postpone the elections for 1 year.
Here, too, we try to cover both sides of the story. We make 2 trips to Homs, the flashpoint city that has borne the brunt of the violence. As a lover of democracy, I will never condone a dictatorship. But I would like to see the dialogue between government and opposition that Assad suggested. The pain and suffering of the Syrian people must come to an end. They should be negotiating with their enemies, not their friends. But the rebels see things differently. On the return trip, we're caught in a crossfire.
That's very close. We are sitting here.
If foreign countries resort to the use of force in Syria, and at the same time armed conflict breaks out with Iran, then we will experience the biggest crisis since World War II.
Dann erleben wir die größte Krise seit dem Zweiten Weltkrieg.
The Mideast will go up in flames, and the whole world along with it. I tirelessly advocate peaceful solutions. It's in the interest of Germany and the entire Western world. Right now, the situation in Syria and Iran is very dangerous. It's January 25th, 2012. We're back in Cairo to mark the one-year anniversary of Egypt's revolution. Thousands have gathered on Tahrir Square. A tense calm resonates. The old regime is clinging to power. Suddenly, gangs loyal to the old regime descend on the crowd. They quickly achieve their goal of fomenting chaos. It takes nearly an hour and assistance from emergency teams to get away from the melee. We've been beaten. Julia was hurt. Many Egyptians are ashamed of what's happening.
Thank you so much.
Don't worry, okay? We Egyptian people.
Okay.
Good.
Very good.
Again, we're in Benghazi, a glimmer of hope. 6 baby boys have been born in the neighborhood where Abdul Latif's family lives. All have been named Abdul Latif in honor of his memory. We were deeply moved by the news. They brought in the 2 baby Abdul Latifs that belonged to the immediate family. I had to fight back the tears. Of course, it's a sign that life goes on.
Das Leben geht weiter.